Commentary on Hegel, Phenomenology of Spirit, 209 to 210, Pinkard translation. This passage occupies a pivotal position in the Phenomenology. It is the hinge on which the entire trajectory of self-consciousness turns into reason. Everything since the master-slave dialectic, the failed attempts of Stoicism and Scepticism to secure a self-sufficient inner freedom by simply withdrawing from or negating the world, has left self-consciousness formally free but existentially empty. The unhappy consciousness is what happens when that emptiness is finally felt. Consciousness discovers that it is essentially double, split between its own contingent, changeable existence and an unchangeable essence it takes to be its truth, and it cannot yet see that this doubling is its own doing. 209 to 210 is where Hegel shows that unhappiness is driven to its most extreme point, and then, without any external intervention, breaks into its opposite. The two paragraphs trace a single continuous arc in 3 stages. 209 shows why every strategy the unhappy consciousness tries against its own individuality must fail on its own terms. It treats that individuality as an enemy, but since the enemy is itself, victory is self-canceling. 209.1 to 209.2, and even the elevation toward the unchangeable, meant to leave individuality behind, turns out to be carried out by that same individuality, and so reintroduces exactly what it was fleeing. 209.3 to 209.6. The unchangeable, once it enters consciousness at all, comes already contaminated by the individuality it was supposed to transcend. 210.1 to 210.5 reinterpret this failure as an achievement in disguise. What looked like contamination is in truth a reciprocal presence of each term in the other, and hence an underlying unity, the one which consciousness, from its own limited standpoint, still experiences as a battlefield of difference, rather than as unity. This is why the relation crystallizes into 3 distinct configurations rather than resolving at once. Individuality opposed to the unchangeable, thrown back into the struggle, the unchangeable taking on the shape of individuality, the incarnate figure, and finally consciousness recognizing its own individuality as already residing within the unchangeable. It is only in this 3rd configuration, 210.6 to 210.9, that the deadlock breaks. Hegel does not argue his way out of the opposition. He simply shows that once the unchangeable is grasped as itself a shape of individuality, the same shape consciousness itself has, the alien tribunal of 209.8 gives way, in the space of a single subordinate clause, to joy and reconciliation. That non-event of a transition is the passage's real significance. It is the first appearance, however immediate and unearned it may still feel, of spirit, the standpoint from which the individual and the universal are no longer opposed terms, but a single self-recognizing life. Everything that follows in the Phenomenology, from reason onward, rests on this quiet pivot. Commentary. The passage under discussion, 209 to 210, forms the next movement of Hegel's treatment of the unhappy consciousness in the chapter on self-consciousness in the Phenomenology of Spirit, where the Stoic and the skeptical consciousness still possessed a certain, if barren, self-sufficiency. The unhappy consciousness is the shape in which self-consciousness first knows itself as internally torn. It is aware of itself both as a changeable, contingent individuality and as related to the unchangeable, without ever being able to unite the two without strain. The paragraphs commented on here trace how this rupture deepens, only to turn ultimately into the first shape of what Hegel calls spirit, i.e., reason. I follow the German text sentence by sentence. 209.1. Es ist damit ein Kampf gegen einen Feind vorhanden, gegen welchen der Sieg vielmehr ein Unterliegen, das eine erreicht zu haben vielmehr der Verlust desselben in seinem Gegenteile ist. As a result, there is a struggle against an enemy in which victory really means defeat, and in which attaining one thing means to an even greater degree losing it in its opposite. Hegel opens with the paradox that carries the whole section. The unhappy consciousness is engaged in a struggle against an enemy such that victory is really a defeat, and attaining the goal is, to a still greater degree, its loss in its very opposite. This is not an incidental misfortune, but a logical necessity. The enemy the consciousness fights is its own individuality, its own changeable, worldly existence. Were it truly to annihilate this enemy, it would thereby annihilate itself as the consciousness that fights. There would be no one left to have won. The enemy is essentially internal, so every victory is one that turns against the victor himself. 209.2. Das Bewusstsein des Lebens, seines Daseins und Tuns ist nur der Schmerz über dieses Dasein und Tun, denn es hat darin nur das Bewusstsein seines Gegenteils als des Wesens und der eigenen Nichtigkeit. Consciousness of life, of its existence, and of its activities, merely amounts to a sorrow over this existence and these activities, for consciousness has therein only the consciousness, both of its opposite as being its essence, and of its own nullity. From this structural self-undermining follows immediately an existential register. Consciousness of life, of its own existence and activity, becomes nothing but sorrow over this existence and activity. This is not an added emotion, but the direct consequence of 209.1. Because in its own existence, consciousness finds only the consciousness of its opposite as the essence, namely the unchangeable, which counts as the true essence, and hence of its own nullity, it can never live its own existence affirmatively. It is worth noting how closely this anticipates what, via Kierkegaard, will later be called despair, a relation to oneself that cannot bear itself. 209.3 Es geht in die Erhebung hieraus zum Unwandelbaren über. In elevating itself beyond this, consciousness makes a transition into the unchangeable, a short, almost breathless transitional sentence. Out of this sorrow arises a movement of elevation, Erhebung toward the unchangeable, the classic gesture of devotion or asceticism, by which consciousness tries to free itself from its earthly individuality by raising itself toward the stable, the divine. Hegel does not present this as a solution, but simply as the next moment in a dialectical movement that has not yet found rest. 209.4 Aber diese Erhebung ist selbst dies Bewusstsein. Sie ist also unmittelbar das Bewusstsein des Gegenteils, nämlich seiner selbst als der Einzelheit. However, this elevation is itself the same consciousness. It is thus immediately the consciousness of the opposite, namely, of itself as individuality. Here the thesis reverses on itself. This very elevation, which was supposed to leave individuality behind, is itself an act of that same individual consciousness, and is therefore immediately also consciousness of the opposite, of itself as individuality. The flight from individuality carries individuality along as its own form. This is the core of Hegel's method. One does not escape a determination by negating it, since the negation itself remains a determinate and hence individual act. 209.5 Das Unwandelbare, das in das Bewusstsein tritt, ist eben dadurch zugleich von der Einzelheit berührt und nur mit dieser gegenwärtig. Precisely by virtue of that, the unchangeable which enters into consciousness is at the same time affected by individuality, and it is present there only together with individuality, a consequence of the foregoing. The unchangeable, as it enters consciousness, is thereby never a pure, untouched, unchangeable. It is affected by individuality precisely in and through its entry, and is present only together with it. There is, in other words, no access to the unchangeable that could shake off the individuality of the access itself. 209.6 Statt diese im Bewusstsein des Unwandelbaren vertilgt zu haben, geht sie darin immer nur hervor. Instead of individuality having been abolished in the consciousness of the unchangeable, it only continues to emerge within it. The paragraph closes with the sharpest formulation of the paradox. Instead of individuality having been extinguished in the consciousness of the unchangeable, it only ever emerges anew within it. Every attempt at self-abolition thus produces, against its own intention, a renewed confirmation of the very thing it sought to abolish. This is the unhappiness of the unhappy consciousness in its purest form, a movement that works against itself at every step. 210.1 In dieser Bewegung aber erfährt es eben dieses Hervortreten der Einzelheit am Unwandelbaren und des Unwandelbaren an der Einzelheit. However, in this movement, consciousness experiences this very emergence of individuality in the unchangeable, and the emergence of the unchangeable in individuality. Section 210 opens with a claim about experience. In the movement just described, consciousness undergoes not merely abstractly, but as lived experience erfährt, the very emergence of individuality in the unchangeable, and conversely of the unchangeable in individuality. The reciprocity is important. It is not only individuality that contaminates the unchangeable, but equally the unchangeable that appears within individuality. 210.2 Es wird für es die Einzelheit überhaupt am unwandelbaren Wesen, und zugleich die seinige an ihm. For consciousness, that individuality itself comes to be in the unchangeable essence, and, at the same time, its own individuality comes to be in the unchangeable essence. This reciprocal interpenetration becomes something consciousness itself notices, für es, for it. Individuality as such comes to be at the unchangeable essence, and at the same time its own individuality comes to be at it. There is thus a double confirmation, individuality in general, and the particular own individuality of this consciousness. 210.3 Denn die Wahrheit dieser Bewegung ist eben das Einssein dieses gedoppelten Bewusstseins. For the truth of this movement is the very oneness of this doubled consciousness. Hegel here states the speculative truth of the whole preceding movement. It consists in the oneness of this doubled consciousness, the individual and the unchangeable consciousness, not in the abolition of one term in favor of the other. As consciousness itself still believes itself to be pursuing, but in their unity as such. This is the characteristically Hegelian move. What at first appears as an insoluble opposition turns out, on closer inspection, already to be the as yet unrecognized unity of the opposed terms. 210.4 Diese Einheit wird ihm aber zunächst selbst eine solche, in welcher noch die Verschiedenheit beider das Herrschende ist. However, in its own eyes, this unity becomes at first itself the sort of unity in which the distinction of both is still dominant. Hegel immediately qualifies this. For consciousness, this unity is at first itself of a kind in which the difference between the two terms remains dominant. The unity is thus at this stage, not yet a reconciled, lived unity, but a formal one, in which the two poles still manage to hold themselves apart, which is why three ways in which the relation appears will now follow. Es ist dadurch die dreifache Weise für dasselbe vorhanden, wie die Einzelnheit mit dem Unwandelbaren verknüpft ist. Einmal geht es selbst sich wieder hervor als entgegengesetzt dem unwandelbaren Wesen. Und es ist in den Anfang des Kampfs zurückgeworfen, welcher das Element des ganzen Verhältnisses bleibt. For that reason, consciousness has on hand the threefold way in which individuality is bound up with the unchangeable. At one time it comes forth once again in its own eyes as opposed to the unchangeable essence, and it is thrown back to the beginning of the struggle, which remains the element of the whole relationship. Hegel now explicitly introduces the threefold structure that will organize the remainder of the chapter on the unhappy consciousness. The first way, consciousness comes forth once again as opposed to the unchangeable essence, and is thrown back to the beginning of the struggle, a struggle that remains the element, the medium of the whole relationship. This corresponds to the pure, inaccessible, unchangeable of the first form of devotion, in which consciousness knows itself merely as rejected individuality over against a distant, unapproachable divine. 210.6 Das andere Mal aber hat das Unwandelbare selbst an ihm die Einzelnheit für es, so dass sie Gestalt des Unwandelbaren ist, an welches hiemit die ganze Weise der Existenz hinübertritt. However, at another time, for consciousness the unchangeable itself has in itself individuality, such that individuality is a shape of the unchangeable, into which the entire way of existing moves. The second way, now the unchangeable itself has in itself individuality for consciousness. That is, individuality has become a shape of the unchangeable, and the entire manner of existence passes over into this shape. This is the moment of the incarnate, individual figure. The unchangeable no longer stands over against consciousness as sheer transcendence, but has itself taken on the form of an individual existence, into which the whole way of existing now migrates. 210.7 Das dritte Mal findet es sich selbst als dieses Einzelne im Unwandelbaren. At a third time, consciousness finds itself to be this individuality within the unchangeable. The third way, consciousness finds itself as this very individual within the unchangeable. This is the decisive step beyond the second. It is no longer merely that the unchangeable has taken on an individual shape somewhere out there, but that consciousness recognizes its own particular disindividual division as already present within the unchangeable itself. 210.8 Das erste Unwandelbare ist ihm nur das Fremde, die Einzelnheit verurteilende Wesen. In its own eyes, the first unchangeable is merely the alien essence passing sentence on it. Hegel now glosses the first of the three moments retrospectively. The first unchangeable is, for consciousness, merely the alien essence that passes judgment on individuality. It is an instance of external condemnation, a tribunal standing over against consciousness, not yet a site of recognition or reconciliation. 210.9 Indem das andere eine Gestalt der Einzelnheit wie es selbst ist, so wird es drittens zum Geiste, hat sich selbst darin zu finden die Freude, und wird sich seine Einzelheit mit dem Allgemeinen versöhnt zu sein bewusst. Since the other unchangeable is a shape of individuality like itself, consciousness becomes thirdly spirit. It has the joy of finding itself therein, and it is aware that its individuality is reconciled with the universal. The final sentence delivers both the third moment and its effective resolution in a single breath. Because the other unchangeable is a shape of individuality like consciousness itself, consciousness thereby becomes thirdly spirit. It has the joy of finding itself therein, and becomes aware that its individuality is reconciled with the universal. Note how tightly the logical transition, the recognition that the unchangeable already shares consciousness's own shape of individuality, and the tonal reversal, from the sorrow of 209 to joy, are fused into one sentence. This is the crux of the whole passage. The passage from unhappy self-consciousness to spirit occurs not through some leap outside the figure of the unhappy consciousness, but through the recognition, achieved from within that very figure, that the unchangeable was never simply alien, that it too is individuality, already like itself. Spirit, in this first still immediate sense, is exactly this mutual recognition between individuality and the unchangeable. The passage illustrates in miniature Hegel's characteristic procedure. An opposition is not resolved from outside, but unfolds until it discloses itself, from within, as already a unity. The path from 209.1 to 210.9 runs from the starkest self-undermining, victory is defeat, to a first fragile joy, the reconciliation of individuality with universality, without the intervening tension ever being simply removed. That this transition, from unhappy consciousness to spirit, is accomplished so unobtrusively, without rhetorical fanfare, in a single subordinate clause, indem das andere eine Gestalt der Einzelheit wie es selbst ist, is characteristic of Hegel's style. The weight of the text lies not in the announcement, but in the sheer necessity of the movement itself. It is precisely this understatement that later readers, Kierkegaard foremost among them, will find suspicious, asking whether Hegel has not resolved too quickly and too painlessly a tension that existence itself may never let go so easily.